What unfolds is not simply a clash of intellect, but a collision between prejudice and truth. A challenge meant to break her becomes the very stage where her strength is revealed, turning humiliation into vindication. Every sneer, every insult, every careless dismissal only sets the stage for a reversal so sharp it silences even the loudest critics. Angela Washington was a black woman in her mid-30s who had long carried the weight of invisibility on her back, forced to swallow the daily sting of working as a janitor in a gleaming Silicon Valley tower, even though she held a degree in mechanical engineering from community college and a lifetime of practical knowledge passed down from her grandfather in Detroit. She had learned to survive by being unseen, pushing her maintenance cart through marble corridors as executives in tailored suits looked past her as if she were part of the furniture. But she also carried within her a quiet fire, the defiant heartbeat of a woman who refused to be defined by the dismissive glances of the powerful. That fire would soon be tested when Richard Sterling, the tall white CEO of Tech Vanguard Industries, turned her invisibility into a cruel spectacle, using her black presence in the boardroom as fodder for mockery in front of his executives and foreign investors. The setting was the executive conference room, a long gleaming table stretching beneath sterile lights, 20 high-ranking staffers seated around it, all of them staring in frustration at the broken AI engine that had cost the company millions of dollars and 6 weeks of humiliation. The engine, designed to power an entire fleet of autonomous trucks, sat lifeless on the polished wood like a taunt, its chrome casing reflecting the anxiety etched on the engineers' faces. It was in this tense silence that Angela entered, wheeling her cart with trash bags and cleaning spray, her blue uniform faintly stained with oil from late-night tinkering sessions on salvage engines at home. She had intended only to change water pitchers and collect discarded coffee cups, but her appearance became Richard Sterling's opportunity to redirect his fury outward. The man stood with cold elegance, his silver tie clipped perfectly, his smile sharp and predatory. He gestured toward her, his voice dripping disdain as he said, "What are the odds? Our janitor thinks she can fix this?" The executives chuckled uneasily, their laughter tinged with cruelty, and Angela froze in the doorway, trash bags clutched in her hands, aware of how the room's attention pressed down on her like a weight designed to crush. Richard's pale eyes locked on hers, narrowing as if she were not a person, but an insect interrupting his empire. He motioned her forward with a snap of his fingers, the sound echoing like a command to a servant, and Angela felt her skin prickle as every gaze followed her slow steps onto the marble floor. He closed the distance until she could smell the expensive cologne layered over the sour odor of arrogance. "Here's a deal, Miss Washington," he sneered, voice loud enough for the back row to hear. "Fix this engine, the one my Ivy League engineers couldn't repair, and I'll promote you right here on the spot. But when you fail, and you will, security will escort you out permanently. I'll make sure every tech firm in Silicon Valley knows about your little stunt." He snapped his fingers again, relishing the sound, and the humiliation thickened in the air. Angela's pulse thudded in her ears, but she held her head high, refusing to let him see fear. She had endured this kind of cruelty before, professors assuming her success was charity, interviewers glancing at her skin before dismissing her resume, co-workers whispering that she was only there to satisfy quotas. Now the cruelty was amplified through the cold glare of boardroom lights and the contempt of a powerful white man determined to use her blackness as entertainment. The executives shifted in their seats, some smirking, others uncomfortable, but none spoke in her defense. Angela's eyes, however, were not on Richard but on the silent machine that dominated the table. She had already studied its blueprints in secret during nights when she mopped this very room, her mind cataloging the discrepancies in measurements, the odd rhythm in its startup cycle, the way its errors hinted at deeper truths the so-called experts had overlooked. The irony was bitter. She had the knowledge, but she was dismissed as nothing more than a janitor. Richard's voice broke her thoughts, sharp and cruel. "God, you even smell like motor oil." His words rippled through the room, drawing more nervous laughter. Angela's jaw tightened. She thought of her grandfather, the black foreman at Ford, who had endured worse insults in the 1970s and had told her engines never cared about skin color, only about respect and listening. She thought of her mother's medical bills that had stolen her chance at a 4-year degree, forcing her into jobs where her hands scrubbed toilets instead of assembling engines, yet her mind still absorbed every technical manual it could touch. Richard mistook her silence for weakness, but it was something else entirely, a gathering storm. To him, she was a pawn in a corporate game, a prop to terrify his engineers and amuse his investors. But to Angela, the challenge was different. It was a chance to step out of invisibility, to show that her black existence in this space was not a token but a truth, and that her mind carried the same brilliance denied to her because of class and race. The room buzzed with whispers as the stakes hung in the air. A $2 million engine, $67 million in contracts, the company's reputation, and Angela's very livelihood. She looked around at the sea of white faces, at men and women who saw her as disposable, and she felt the fire inside her spread. She had nothing to lose but everything to prove. The executives would later say the boardroom seemed to hold its breath in that moment, as if waiting for the janitor to shrink away. But Angela did not shrink. She straightened her back, squared her shoulders, and turned her eyes toward the engine like a mechanic greeting an old friend. Yet day after day, the result was the same. The engine would start, run smoothly for 14 minutes and 37 seconds, then overheat and collapse into silence, mocking them with the same error code harmonic disruption detected. Angela had not been assigned to solve it, of course. She had been assigned to mop floors and empty waste baskets. But while pushing her cart, she had seen the blueprints left scattered on tables, had studied the specs with the eyes of someone who knew engines by instinct and by heritage. What the boardroom of privileged men and women could not admit was that their own brilliance had failed, and failure only grew heavier with each passing day. Tech Vanguard was supposed to be on the cusp of revolutionizing delivery systems across America with an engine capable of 93% efficiency, a number so astonishing it had attracted German investors willing to pour millions into expansion. But the company's crown jewel now sat lifeless. The engineers, most of them young, white, and eager to justify their salaries, had tried everything from hardware replacements to software patches, from consultations with AI specialists to bizarre theories about office feng shui interfering with electronics. Every attempt had ended in embarrassment. Angela watched them sometimes from the shadows while she scrubbed tables, her mind racing ahead of their theories, noticing what they did not: the discrepancies between German metric measurements and American imperial programming, a subtle misalignment that cascaded through the system until the engine tore itself apart. It was obvious to her because she had spent nights with salvaged motors in her small apartment, learning the rhythms of machines, listening the way her grandfather had taught her, while those engineers trusted only in numbers without hearing the song behind them. Yet in this company, her insights did not matter. The boardroom was an arena of privilege, where the engineers wore their Harvard and MIT rings like armor, and where a black janitor could only ever be seen as background noise. The culture reinforced Richard Sterling's arrogance. Those with money and pedigree were always right, even when they failed, while those with grease-stained hands were meant to stay invisible. Every morning, Angela saw the coffee cup stacked higher, the desperation deepening, and every morning she overheard executives whisper about the millions at stake, $67 million in contracts that would vanish if the engine did not run by Friday. Richard's fury only grew, his voice echoing like a whip as he berated the engineers, calling them incompetent while still never lowering his gaze to the woman sweeping the floor. Angela became a silent witness to hypocrisy, seeing both the fragility of privilege and the cruelty of dismissal. One Tuesday, she watched as Emily Brooks, the young white team leader from MIT, tried to present a new diagnostic theory with dark circles under her eyes, her voice breaking under pressure, only for Richard to dismiss her with a sneer and slam his hand against the table. Even among his chosen elite, failure was punished, but still, no one dared to suggest that the woman in the janitor's uniform might see what they could not. Angela carried the memory of her grandfather's words like armor. An engine doesn't care about diplomas, it responds only to those who respect it. She clung to that as she pushed her mop across marble floors, feeling the sting of every executive glance that passed through her like she was invisible. In quiet moments when the boardroom emptied and the night was hers, she would pause beside the engine, lay her hands lightly on its cold surface, and imagine its heartbeat struggling to find rhythm. She would trace the blueprints left behind and whisper calculations to herself, aligning German millimeters against American inches, knowing the secret others could not grasp. But her uniform and her skin made her invisible to a system built on privilege. In internal emails she accidentally glimpsed on glowing screens, she saw the truth spelled out in cruel shorthand. She was the cleaning girl, a diversity checkbox, a disposable cost. The executives joked about her behind her back, laughing emojis scattered through threads about whether she could even read the company directory. Richard himself scheduled her cleaning during investor tours, pretending to be generous by saying Tech Vanguard gave opportunities to everyone, his tone soaked in condescension. And yet, the irony thickened because while the privileged struggled and failed, the so-called janitor understood the engine better than any of them. Angela moved through the building like a ghost, yet she was never free from being the subject of conversation. On more than one occasion, she overheard her name tossed casually into jokes in the cafeteria, laughter erupting when someone mimicked her voice or mocked her uniform. Richard Sterling himself fueled the culture, sending internal emails that referred to her as the cleaning girl, despite her official title of technical consultant. The executives followed his lead, trading dismissive comments that reduced her to a token of diversity rather than a human being with knowledge and dignity. She discovered threads filled with laughing emojis where HR manager David Walsh joked about whether she could even read the company directory. To them, she was not a person, but a symbol of what they considered expendable. It stung not just because the words were cruel, but because they confirmed what she had always suspected, that every polite smile she encountered in the halls was built on a foundation of quiet disdain. The scars of such treatment were deep, etched over years of being overlooked and underestimated. But this time, they cut sharper because she knew she carried answers they desperately needed. She continued to study the engine in silence, her mind turning over calculations during late-night cleaning shifts, noticing again the mismatch between German precision tolerances and American programming. Yet, when she lingered too long near the blueprints, she would hear footsteps and the shuffle of papers as engineers reclaimed their work, looking at her with annoyance as if she were trespassing in a world reserved for them. The irony was heavy. The people who dismissed her were the same ones drowning in failure, and still, they never considered her insights worth hearing. Instead, they whispered among themselves that perhaps her very presence was dragging them down, that diversity hires were distractions in times of crisis. Angela pretended not to hear, but every word lodged in her chest like a stone. The weight of discrimination followed her into the smallest moments. When investors toured the building and Richard made a point of calling attention to her with his false generosity, saying, "We believe in giving opportunities to everyone, even our maintenance staff." His voice carried the tone of charity, as if she were a prop to display rather than an employee with a role. The investors nodded politely, their eyes sliding past her, but Angela felt the humiliation burn hotter than any insult. She thought of her grandfather, who had endured being the only black foreman at Ford and who had taught her that machines did not care about prejudice. She thought of her mother, who fought cancer with quiet dignity despite medical bills that chained Angela to this building. She thought of herself, standing at the intersection of dreams deferred and skills unacknowledged, trying to survive in a system that thrived on exclusion. Still, she endured, because endurance had always been her armor. She used silence as protection, but silence did not stop the cruelty. Even colleagues like Sarah Kim, who had once smiled at her in the break room, now shifted uncomfortably when Richard suggested in meetings that dead weight was dragging the company down. Sarah did not speak up, though her eyes betrayed discomfort. The silence of allies was almost as painful as the mockery of enemies. Angela knew this dynamic well, the way discrimination spread not only through outright insults, but through complicity, through the choice of good people to remain quiet in order to keep their own positions safe. Invisibility was survival, yet invisibility also erased the dignity she fought to preserve. Every day she walked the halls with her cart, pushing through waves of contempt, knowing that if she revealed what she had discovered, she might be laughed out of the building. And yet deep inside, she also knew that the truth of the engine's flaw could not remain hidden forever. She had seen the data, heard the vibrations during late-night tests, recognized a pattern that eluded the privileged minds drowning in their own arrogance. The scars of discrimination shaped her resolve, She would not speak until the moment was right, until silence itself became unbearable. That moment had not yet come, but it was approaching. Each cruel email, each dismissive glance, each humiliating comment about her supposed illiteracy became fuel for the fire inside her. That moment arrived with the arrival of the German investors. On Wednesday afternoon, black luxury sedans rolled up to the polished front of Tech Vanguard Industries, carrying with them the future of the company. At the center of the delegation was Dr. Claudia Muller, a woman in her 50s with an air of icy precision, CEO of a Bavarian engineering giant known for uncompromising standards. Alongside her walked Dr. Javier Rodriguez, a former Tesla engineer with decades of experience in powertrain systems, his reputation for detecting flaws in seconds making him a living legend in automotive circles. Their presence in the building sent ripples of anxiety through every department, for this was not a mere business tour, but a decisive evaluation that could secure or destroy 100 million euros of investment. Employees whispered in elevators about champagne orders already placed in the cafeteria for a celebration that now felt more like a gamble than a certainty. Richard Sterling's temper only sharpened as the day wore on, his mask of control cracking in moments of frustration. Assistants scurried through halls with endless cups of coffee, while engineers argued in hushed voices about last-minute theories that could not possibly be tested in time. Angela watched it all while she polished marble floors, her silence giving her a vantage point no one else occupied. She saw the way privilege turned desperation into cruelty, the way Richard's voice rose like a blade as he told his team that failure meant not only lost contracts but lost jobs. She saw the way employees flinched at his anger, yet none dared to question his leadership. She heard his words about cutting non-essential staff and felt his eyes rest on her as though her presence itself was an obstacle. Still, she kept her head down, sweeping corners while investors walked past her without a glance, just as intended. The company had perfected the art of making her invisible, but invisibility gave her time to observe. She knew the engine would not survive another test, not without the adjustment she had already calculated in her mind. That knowledge sat like a stone in her chest, heavy and undeniable. On Thursday morning, the inevitable happened. The final demonstration before the investors collapsed into chaos when the engine filled the boardroom with acrid smoke, the fire suppression system drenching everyone in a chemical mist. Angela stood at the back, watching white-shirted engineers dripping wet, their laptops ruined, their faces pale with humiliation. Dr. Muller's expression remained unreadable, though her sharp eyes missed nothing. Dr. Rodriguez filled page after page of notes in his leather notebook, his pen scratching with merciless precision. The German investors whispered to one another in clipped sentences, their body language suggesting departure. The future of Tech Vanguard teetered on the edge of ruin, and Richard Sterling knew it. In desperation, he called an emergency all-hands meeting. 200 employees crammed into the main auditorium, their faces reflecting despair. Angela again found herself at the back, near the emergency exit, invisible among the mass of expensive suits. Richard took the podium, his voice trembling despite his attempt at authority. He spoke of crisis, of the revolutionary engine that refused to operate, of exhausted engineers and lost solutions. Then his words shifted toward threats. He announced that cost-cutting would begin immediately, that non-essential positions would be eliminated. His gaze swept across the room like a predator seeking prey, and once again, it lingered on Angela. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, the silence of fear mixing with the desperation of those who knew layoffs meant ruin. Angela felt her chest tighten, her hands curling into fists at her sides. She had endured insults, invisibility, and humiliation, but the threat of losing the meager job that kept her mother's treatments alive pressed harder than ever. And yet, something inside her broke free in that moment, something stronger than fear. She raised her hand. Her voice carried clear across the auditorium, amplified by the microphone system that made sure every ear heard. "Sir," she said, "I think the problem isn't in the software. I believe it's in the harmonic frequency calibration." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. 200 heads turned in unison, eyes locking on to the black woman in the maintenance uniform who had dared to speak in a room where her silence was expected. Murmurs surged like a wave. The German investors leaned forward in their seats, their expressions shifting from disinterest to intrigue. Dr. Rodriguez raised one eyebrow, his pen pausing above the page. Angela felt her heart pounding, but she kept her shoulders square, her eyes steady. Richard's face twisted through surprise, then rage, then something more dangerous: calculation. He had intended to make her the first sacrifice, a symbol of non-essential failure, but her words had caught the attention of those whose approval he desperately needed. To silence her outright would risk appearing blind to potential insight in front of Claudia Muller and her delegation, and so his cruelty reshaped itself into opportunity. He smiled, but the smile carried no warmth. It was sharp, theatrical, a predator adapting to the hunt. "Well, well," he said into the microphone, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "our janitor has an opinion about advanced engineering." He could feel the investors' eyes on him. He could see Dr. Claudia Muller leaning forward with sudden interest, and he could sense that to dismiss Angela outright might risk looking blind or arrogant in front of those who controlled the fate of his company. His mind raced, and then the cold cunning that had built his empire took hold. If he could not silence her, he would weaponize her courage into a public spectacle designed to destroy her. Slowly, his lips curled into a cruel smile. "Well, well," he said, his voice rising so the microphone carried it through every corner of the room. "Our janitor believes she has solved what 67 of our top engineers could not." His tone dripped with venom, each word cutting into Angela like a blade. But he did not stop there. He gestured with one hand toward the German delegation seated in the front row, his theatrics unfolding with practiced flair. "Ladies and gentlemen, these investors flew across the Atlantic to see American innovation. What better demonstration than to let our maintenance consultant prove her theory in front of all of us?" The crowd stirred with uneasy laughter, though many avoided eye contact, unwilling to be caught on the wrong side of whatever was about to unfold. Angela felt the weight of every eye on her, but she stood tall at the back, her chest rising and falling as if drawing strength from somewhere deep within. Richard was not finished. He stepped down from the podium and paced across the stage like a ringmaster preparing the main event. "Here are the terms," he declared. "You have 2 hours, Miss Washington. 2 hours to repair this engine that has defeated some of the brightest minds in the world. If by some miracle you succeed, I will personally promote you to senior engineering consultant with the salary and stock options to match." Murmurs erupted among the employees, the absurdity of the offer colliding with their disbelief that she could ever succeed. Richard's smile sharpened as he delivered the crueler half of the bargain. "But when you fail, and we all know you will be terminated immediately. Security will escort you out, and I will ensure every tech firm in Silicon Valley knows of your spectacular failure. You will never work in this industry again." His words slammed into the room like a hammer, each syllable echoing with finality. Angela's stomach clenched, but her face betrayed no fear. Richard lifted his hand, snapping his fingers, and 2 security guards appeared at the auditorium doors, their presence a reminder that this was not just a challenge, but an execution theater. The tension was so thick that even the investors leaned forward in their seats, sensing the drama unfolding. Dr. Javier Rodriguez rose from his chair, his authoritative presence cutting through the noise. At 62, his reputation alone commanded silence. "If this test is to happen," he said, his voice steady and deliberate, "it requires neutral oversight. I will serve as technical witness to ensure fairness and accuracy." His announcement shifted the atmosphere in an instant. What Richard intended as a cruel humiliation was now becoming a legitimate evaluation, transformed by Rodriguez's reputation into something that carried weight beyond theatrics. "Doctor?" Muller nodded approvingly, her eyes never leaving Angela. "Excellent," she said, her precise English carrying the weight of judgment. "We are curious to see American problem-solving methods." Richard's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but retreat was impossible now. The crowd buzzed with excitement, employees pulling out their phones to record or text, aware that whatever happened next would be remembered far beyond this building. The balance of power had shifted, and though Richard still believed he would win by destroying Angela, a current of possibility now ran through the room. Noticing this, Richard added one final twist to regain control. He turned to the company's media team and snapped, "We're live streaming this challenge. Set up the cameras." Let the entire world see what happens when unqualified people attempt jobs beyond their ability. His words dripped with poison, but the marketing assistant sprang into action, arranging lights, cameras, and microphones. Within minutes, Tech Vanguard's social media accounts began broadcasting the event to thousands of viewers, hashtags already forming as the story spread across industry networks. Angela stood motionless at the back, her heart pounding but her resolve hardening with every second. She thought of her grandfather's words, how engines had souls that spoke to those who truly listened, and she realized that this was the moment she had unknowingly prepared for her entire life. She was no longer just a janitor in their eyes. She was about to become either a cautionary tale or a revelation. Dr. Rodriguez approached her quietly, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "Young lady, are you certain you want to proceed? This isn't just about fixing an engine. Your future is at stake." Angela met his gaze with steady eyes. "Sir," she said, "I've been listening to engines my whole life. This one has been trying to tell us what's wrong. No one has been hearing it. I think it's time someone finally did." Rodriguez studied her for a long moment, then nodded with the gravity of a man who had seen talent in unexpected places. "Very well," he said, loud enough for the microphones to capture. "Let's see what she can do." The auditorium erupted into whispers, employees buzzing with anticipation, some amused, others skeptical, a few quietly hopeful. Richard's plan to humiliate her had spiraled into something larger, something he no longer fully controlled, yet he pressed forward, his expression a mask of confidence. "Fine," he barked. 2 hours. Get to work." The crowd surged toward the executive floor, following Angela as she walked steadily toward the boardroom where the engine waited like a judge ready to deliver its verdict. Phones recorded every step, investor eyes followed with keen interest, and employees pressed against the glass walls of the boardroom to witness the drama. Angela Washington entered the boardroom with 200 employees pressing against the glass walls, investors seated like a tribunal, and cameras capturing every movement for thousands watching online. The atmosphere crackled with tension, the hum of equipment mixing with whispers of doubt and anticipation. Richard Sterling stood off to the side, smug in his belief that he had engineered the perfect public execution, his eyes glittering with the cruel satisfaction of a man convinced of his superiority. Yet while he relished the humiliation he expected to unfold, Angela's mind drifted elsewhere, away from the sterile boardroom and into the memory of a garage on Detroit's 8 Mile Road, where the scent of oil and steel had been as comforting as any embrace. She saw her grandfather, Samuel Washington, his weathered black hands moving with the grace of a surgeon as he coaxed life back into engines others had declared dead. He had been one of the first black foremen at Ford during an era when such a position required more than just talent. It required unshakable resolve in the face of systemic prejudice. As a child, Angela had watched him bend over a broken Mustang, his eyes narrowing in concentration, his fingers tracing the engine block as if reading scripture. "Come here, girl," he had said to her, his voice steady and warm. "Time you learned something useful." That summer had changed everything. While other kids played video games or roamed the neighborhood, Angela spent her days by his side, her small hands learning to grip wrenches, her ears attuned to the rhythm of pistons, her nose trained to detect the faint scents that revealed coolant leaks or oil degradation. Her grandfather had taught her that an engine had a voice, a soul, and that the key to mastery was not brute force or complicated formulas, but listening with patience and respect. He placed her hand on a running motor, guiding her fingers to feel the subtle vibrations. "That's the heartbeat," he whispered. 4 cylinders talking to each other, 8,000 explosions a minute, all working in perfect harmony. An engine doesn't care about your diploma or your skin color. It only responds to those who truly listen. Those lessons had stayed with her long after the garage closed, after Samuel collapsed from a heart attack beneath the hood of a Cadillac, after the funeral filled with mechanics, engineers, and customers who came to pay respects to the man who had resurrected impossible machines. His tools were sold to pay medical bills, but his wisdom became Angela's inheritance, etched into her very bones. That wisdom had carried her through community college, through nights of exhaustion when she worked multiple jobs while caring for her mother, through the bitter decision to abandon dreams of a 4-year degree because chemotherapy cost more than hope. It carried her even now as she faced the sneers of executives and the calculating malice of Richard Sterling. As Angela stood before the broken engine, she felt her grandfather's presence like a steady hand on her shoulder. She closed her eyes for a moment, shutting out the noise of the crowd, and imagined herself back in that Detroit garage, the hum of an old radio in the background, the smell of grease and gasoline in the air, her grandfather's voice urging her to trust what she heard and felt. Engines did not lie, and neither did the rhythm she could already sense beneath the machine's silence. She opened her eyes to find Dr. Javier Rodriguez watching her with measured curiosity, his pen poised above his notebook as if ready to record not just her failure, but the possibility of brilliance. Claudia Muller sat with her arms folded, her sharp eyes cutting through the theater to evaluate substance over show. Angela placed her calloused hands flat against the engine's casing, her palms absorbing the faint residual vibrations. She leaned in, listening to the silence as though it were a whisper. The crowd shifted uneasily, executives exchanging skeptical glances, some smirking, others biting their lips. To them, it looked like a janitor performing a ritual, an absurd pantomime before inevitable humiliation. But to Angela, it was communion. She remembered her grandfather's warning. White folks will test you twice as hard, assume you are half as smart, but when you fix what they cannot, suddenly your color matters less. She had lived that truth her entire life, and she was about to live it again. The boardroom itself seemed to fade, the investors' whispers dimming, the camera's blinking lights becoming irrelevant. All that mattered was the engine and the lessons she carried inside her. She traced her fingers along the seams of the housing, noting the subtle misalignments, the signs of stress at connection points, the tiny differences in tolerance that betrayed a conversation lost in translation between German precision and American software. She inhaled deeply, letting the knowledge settle into her bones. She thought of the countless nights she had studied technical manuals in her cramped apartment, textbooks piled around her, salvage parts spread across the floor like archaeological artifacts. She thought of her mother sleeping in the next room after chemo treatments, unaware that her daughter was building an education in the quiet hours, transforming grief and exhaustion into knowledge that would one day demand recognition. Angela spoke softly but firmly, her words carrying through the microphones. "This machine has been fighting itself," she said. "The problem isn't software, it's harmony." The murmurs grew louder, some mocking, some surprised. Richard Sterling's smile tightened, though he said nothing, unwilling to interrupt the performance he believed would end in her ruin. Angela ignored him. She was speaking to the engine, to her grandfather, to herself. She explained how every machine had a natural frequency, a rhythm where all components worked in synchronization, and how this engine had been designed to operate at one frequency while its AI demanded another. She did not reveal everything yet, but her voice carried authority, enough to quiet the room. Dr. Rodriguez leaned closer, his notebook filling with notes. Claudia Miller's eyes narrowed, interest sharpening. She spoke slowly, her voice steady despite the weight of 200 stares. "This engine isn't broken in the way you think," she said. "It isn't the software patch or faulty coding. It's harmony. The machine is fighting against itself." Her words cut through the air like a blade. Engineers shifted uncomfortably, some smirking in disbelief, others frowning as if trying to reconcile their endless failures with the simplicity of her claim. Emily Brooks, the MIT-trained team leader, muttered under her breath, "Impossible." "We tested everything." Angela ignored the comment and leaned closer to the machine, her ear almost brushing the casing. "Every engine has a natural frequency," she continued, "a rhythm where all components move in synchronization. This one was built to run at that frequency, but the AI was programmed to expect a slightly different one. The result is a constant struggle, a machine correcting for problems that don't actually exist until it collapses under the pressure." "Doctor?" Rodriguez scribbled furiously in his notebook, his sharp eyes flicking up to study her face. "Explain further," he demanded. Angela reached for the scattered blueprints and laid them flat across the polished conference table, her finger tracing lines with the precision of someone who had memorized every measurement during lonely nights of cleaning. "The crankshaft was machined in Munich to 87.63 millimeters, she said, pointing to the German specifications. But the AI calibration assumes 3.450 inches, which converts to 87.663 millimeters. On paper, they look identical. In practice, that's a difference of 0.003 of a millimeter, enough to cause cascading errors when the system runs at high frequencies. Gasps rippled across the crowd. Some employees leaned closer to the glass as though they could better hear the math that had eluded entire teams of credentialed experts. Claudia Muller's eyes gleamed, the faintest smile tugging at her lips as she recognized the accuracy of the statement. German tolerances allow plus or minus 0.001 millimeters, Angela added. American tolerances allow 5/1000ths of an inch, which is roughly 0.127 millimeters. The engine's parts are too precise for the AI's assumptions. The machine keeps making corrections that are unnecessary, forcing components out of alignment until the system overheats. That's why it always fails after exactly 14 minutes and 37 seconds. That's when the resonance becomes critical. Emily Brooks stepped forward, her face pale. "That's not possible," she whispered. "We checked tolerances repeatedly." Angela turned to her calmly. "You checked the tolerances the AI was programmed to expect, not the actual tolerances of the German components. You were listening to the wrong voice." Her words silenced Emily, leaving her to retreat into the crowd. Richard Sterling's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly masked it, unwilling to let Angela see the cracks forming in his confidence. He gestured toward her dismissively. "So what's your miracle solution then, Miss Washington? Shall we call Germany and ask them to remake every part of this engine? Or perhaps we should rewrite all the AI software from scratch? Tell us, what's the janitor's fix for a $100 million problem?" Laughter bubbled up among a few executives, but it was nervous, uncertain. Angela did not flinch. Instead, she reached into a storage cabinet, pulling out a small metal disc no larger than a hockey puck, perforated with carefully calculated holes. She held it up for everyone to see, her calloused hands steady beneath the weight of hundreds of eyes. "This," she said simply. Confusion rippled through the room. "It's a harmonic dampener," Angela explained. "Instead of rewriting the AI or remanufacturing the components, we bridge the gap between them. This buffer absorbs the tiny frequency mismatch and translates it, allowing the AI and the mechanical parts to work in harmony. It costs about $50 to make." The room erupted in disbelief. Richard Sterling's voice rose with venom. "You're suggesting that a $50 part solves what 6 weeks of consulting and millions of dollars couldn't?" Angela met his glare calmly. "Sometimes the simplest solutions are the right ones. The AI and the engine are both perfect. They just need a translator." Dr. Rodriguez leaned forward, his eyes locked on the disc. "Show us," he said. Angela knelt beside the engine, her movements deliberate and practiced. Every twist of the wrench echoing years of experience learned in her grandfather's garage, every adjustment a testament to the night she had rebuilt engines on borrowed time. The employees pressed harder against the glass, their breath fogging the panes as they recorded her every move on their phones. The investors whispered in German, their voices tense but filled with a rising current of interest. Angela worked swiftly, tightening the final bolts in place, then rose to her feet and wiped her hands on her uniform. "Ready?" she said. The boardroom fell into silence, the weight of history pressing down on the moment. For weeks, the engine had been nothing but a source of failure and embarrassment. Now, in the hands of the woman they had mocked, it was poised to speak again. Dr. Rodriguez stepped to the diagnostic equipment, nodding to Angela. "Start it." Angela reached for the ignition, her hand steady, her pulse racing. She turned the key, and the engine roared to life with a deep, even rumble that reverberated through the boardroom like a promise. For a moment, it was just noise, but Angela heard it differently. She heard balance, rhythm, a machine finally singing in its natural key. She raised her voice above the sound. "At 2,800 RPM, there's no mismatch. It's running in harmony now. Doctor?" Rodriguez's eyes widened as he studied the readouts. The green lights lit up across the diagnostic screens, temperatures holding steady, pressure readings perfect, vibrations balanced. "Remarkable," he murmured. Claudia Mueller's lips curved into a knowing smile. Employees gasped, their disbelief turning into awe. Dr. Javier Rodriguez moved swiftly between stations, his pen forgotten as he stared at data streams that were clean for the first time since the engine's creation. Oil pressure remained stable, temperature hovered at ideal levels, vibrations aligned in perfect frequency. "This is extraordinary," he muttered, his voice carrying both disbelief and reverence. Claudia Muller leaned forward, her sharp eyes scanning every measurement, her fingers tapping against the armrest in precise rhythm with the engine's steady pulse. 97.3% efficiency, she whispered, her tone tinged with awe. Higher than theoretical. Around the glass walls, employees pressed closer, their phones raised to record the moment, their faces a mosaic of amazement, envy, and reluctant admiration. The live stream numbers surged into the tens of thousands, the comment section exploding with astonishment from industry professionals and casual viewers alike. Angela's name began to appear in hashtags, her story spreading beyond the building faster than Richard Sterling could control. Richard himself stood rigid by the windows, his arms crossed, his confident smile gone, replaced by a pale mask of disbelief. He had designed this as a spectacle of humiliation, certain that the black janitor would falter under the weight of impossible pressure, but the narrative had turned on him with brutal precision. Each second the engine continued to run was another crack in the authority he had wielded like a weapon. Angela, however, was not watching Richard. She was listening to the engine, hearing its steady hum with the practiced ear of someone who had spent her life tuning machines by instinct. She recognized the absence of strain, the absence of the discordant struggle that had plagued it before, and she felt a surge of pride so strong it nearly brought tears to her eyes. She thought of her grandfather's words, of her mother's sacrifices, of every insult and dismissal she had endured in these halls, and realized that this moment belonged to them as much as it belonged to her. Still, she knew the true test had not yet arrived. Richard seized on that sliver of hope, his voice sharp as he barked. Fine, it runs, but can it actually power the system? Can it drive a vehicle without collapsing under load? He gestured toward the prototype truck parked in the courtyard below, its sleek frame visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. For weeks it had sat lifeless, its navigation systems dormant, waiting for a heart that could sustain it. Angela met his challenge with steady eyes and a nod. Let's find out. With assistance from a few reluctant engineers, the engine was connected to the truck systems. The boardroom fell into hushed silence as cables were attached, data fed through monitors, and the ignition sequence prepared. Angela stood by the truck, her hands steady on the controls, her uniform stark against the polished machinery. She pressed the ignition, and the truck shuddered to life, headlights flickering before blazing into brightness. Inside, dashboards lit up, radar sensors activated, and the onboard AI came online with a precision it had never displayed before. Gasps filled the room as the vehicle eased backward out of its parking spot, moving with computer-controlled grace. The truck navigated the courtyard, weaving around landscaping features, executing turns with flawless accuracy, and then completing a parallel parking maneuver so precise it drew spontaneous applause from the employees. Minute stick bust. 10 minutes, 14 minutes, 20 minutes. Each milestone shattered the old curse, proving beyond doubt that the flaw had been banished. The truck continued running smoothly, sensors feeding flawless data, systems humming in harmony. The investors whispered in excited German, their once stoic faces now lit with genuine enthusiasm. Claudia Muller's assistant typed furiously on her tablet, documenting performance metrics that exceeded every original proposal. 30 minutes passed. 37 minutes. The dreaded shutdown point was long behind them, and still the engine purred. Angela remained calm, her hand again resting lightly on the engine, as if reassuring it that it was finally free to be itself. Doctor, Rodriguez turned to the crowd, his voice ringing with authority. This, he declared, is not luck. This is engineering intuition of the highest order. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then building in waves as employees realized they were witnessing not just the salvation of their company, but the rewriting of its story. On social media, viewership surpassed 50,000, then 60,000, the story of the black janitor who had solved what Ivy League teams could not, spreading like wildfire. Hashtags like Engineering Justice and Angela Washington trended across platforms. For Angela, the noise faded into the background. She thought only of her grandfather's garage, of the times he had placed her small hands on engines and told her to listen. She felt his presence in the hum of the machine, in the rhythm of harmony achieved, in the vindication of a life spent underestimated but never broken. Richard Sterling tried once more to claw back control, his voice cutting through the applause. "We need more than a demonstration," he snapped. We need assurance this solution can hold under real-world conditions. His words sounded hollow even to his own ears, but he clung to them like a drowning man clinging to driftwood. Claudia Mueller rose from her seat, her sharp gaze pinning him in place. "We have seen enough," she said, her precise tone carrying finality. "The solution is elegant, simple, and effective. It is exactly the kind of innovation we value." Her declaration sealed Richard's defeat, but it lifted Angela higher than she had ever imagined. The engine powered down smoothly, the truck returning to its position, the diagnostic screens glowing green long after silence settled over the courtyard. The boardroom was still trembling with the echoes of applause when Angela Washington stepped back from the engine, her hand lingering on the warm casing as if reluctant to let go of the heartbeat she had restored. Around her, the atmosphere had transformed from despair to elation, from mockery to stunned admiration, and the faces pressed against the glass reflected awe instead of disdain. The German investors leaned forward, their eyes gleaming with excitement, while Claudia Mueller conferred with her assistant in rapid German, her voice taut with satisfaction. Dr. Javier Rodriguez closed his notebook with deliberate finality, the weight of his gaze settling on Angela as though to silently acknowledge that he had just witnessed something historic. In that moment, the balance of power, carefully orchestrated by Richard Sterling for years, began to collapse. Richard stood near the windows, his confident smile long gone, his complexion pale beneath the harsh lights. He had expected humiliation, a spectacle that would cement his dominance by destroying the credibility of a black janitor in front of his investors. But instead, the spectacle had devoured him. Each passing second that the engine purred smoothly was another nail in the coffin of his authority. The live stream had surged past 100,000 viewers, the comments no longer mocking Angela but celebrating her brilliance and condemning the arrogance of leadership that had dismissed her. Across LinkedIn and Twitter, engineers, CEOs, and journalists alike were already sharing clips, declaring that a janitor had succeeded where entire Ivy League teams had failed. Angela's name was trending globally, while Richard's was rapidly becoming synonymous with incompetence and prejudice. Yet Angela did not bask in the spotlight. She stood quietly, her expression calm, her posture steady, letting the truth of the machine speak louder than anything she could say. She had not sought revenge or humiliation. She had sought harmony, both for the engine and for herself. The applause faded into murmurs as Claudia Mueller rose from her seat, her presence commanding silence. She turned to the board and spoke with the authority of someone who controlled the future of billions in investment. "Our delegation has seen enough," she declared. "This solution is not only correct, it is elegant, efficient, and visionary. We are prepared to increase our investment commitment by 20%, contingent upon one condition, that Ms. Washington lead the European Engine Development Program." The room erupted in gasps. The additional 20 million euros promised to elevate Tech Vanguard from a promising startup into a global power player. Employees turned to one another in disbelief, some smiling with relief, others shaking their heads at the irony that the woman they had ignored, mocked, and dismissed was now the very reason their jobs would be saved. Richard's lips parted in protest, but before he could speak, Dr. Rodriguez stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of decades of respect in the industry. "I will personally recommend Ms. Washington for immediate promotion to senior diagnostics engineer. Her analysis was mathematically sound, her execution flawless, and her intuition unmatched. In my 40 years of engineering, I have rarely seen such clarity of thought under pressure." His words sealed the matter. The employees broke into applause once more, though now it carried a different tone, not just relief, but respect. Even Emily Brooks, the MIT-trained team leader who had once dismissed Angela's presence, stepped forward with humility etched on her face. "Our entire team apologizes," she said, her voice unsteady. "We overlooked insights that could have saved us weeks of failure. We would be honored to collaborate with you on future projects." The transformation was complete. In less than 2 hours, Angela had risen from invisibility to leadership, from a janitor mocked by her CEO to a senior engineer celebrated by global investors. Richard Sterling, meanwhile, stood isolated, his authority crumbling as the board members exchanged glances that spoke volumes. The German investors whispered about management failures, their sharp tones underscoring concerns about leadership incompetence. Claudia Mueller's assistant typed furiously on her tablet, already drafting clauses that would tie continued investment to changes in executive decision-making. Dr. Rodriguez closed his notebook and looked Richard directly in the eye. Your leadership nearly cost this company everything. You attempted to humiliate talent rather than recognize it. That is not innovation. That is arrogance. Richard's jaw clenched, but no words came. He could feel the camera still streaming, capturing every flicker of his downfall. He turned away, staring out at the Silicon Valley skyline as if the view might salvage his pride, but the image of his own investors celebrating Angela made it clear that the narrative had shifted beyond his control. Angela, standing at the center of it all, remained composed. She thought again of her grandfather's voice, of the lessons whispered in Detroit garages, of his reminder that engines did not care about skin color, only about respect. She realized that this moment was more than vindication for her. It was proof that talent could not be permanently buried beneath prejudice. The scars of discrimination still marked her, but now those scars were visible to the world as evidence of resilience. The board members called for an immediate governance review, their voices sharp with urgency. They demanded to know why a qualified employee had been relegated to maintenance duties while expensive consulting teams had floundered. They promised investigations into Richard's emails, his discriminatory remarks, his misuse of authority. Richard's silence was his only shield, but it was a shield riddled with holes. By the end of the meeting, the verdict was clear. Angela would lead, Richard would fall, and Tech Vanguard would be reborn not through arrogance, but through the recognition of hidden brilliance. The employees left the boardroom buzzing with disbelief, already sharing the story across their networks. The boardroom emptied slowly after the storm of revelation, employees dispersing in clusters of hushed conversations, their faces still carrying the disbelief that a black janitor had saved the company when the brightest names in engineering could not. The German investors departed with smiles and handshakes, their departure marked by the quiet satisfaction of a partnership secured and expanded, while reporters outside the building already prepared headlines about the woman whose $50 solution had humiliated Silicon Valley arrogance. Angela Washington remained by the engine, her hand still resting gently against the casing, the vibration of harmony still coursing through her palm as if the machine itself were whispering its thanks. She felt tired yet alive, the weight of years of invisibility finally beginning to lift. For the first time since she had walked into the company 3 years earlier, people looked at her with recognition instead of dismissal, respect instead of pity. Yet the victory was not just hers. It belonged to her grandfather whose wisdom still guided her, to her mother whose sacrifices had anchored her, and to every person who had ever been told they were less than what they truly were. The aftermath was swift and merciless for Richard Sterling. Within days, the board launched a formal investigation into his discriminatory practices, combing through the emails where he mocked Angela and referred to her as the cleaning girl, exposing his deliberate attempts to humiliate her before investors, and documenting the culture of cruelty he had fostered. 2 weeks later, he was stripped of his role as CEO, demoted to a powerless advisory position with his salary slashed and his reputation in tatters. The man who had once sneered at Angela's presence now found himself the subject of derision in industry circles, his downfall sealed not by external competitors, but by his own arrogance. Angela, on the other hand, stepped into her new role as senior diagnostics engineer with quiet confidence. Her salary tripled, her title finally reflected her ability, and she was tasked with leading a diverse team of engineers to ensure that talent in the company would never again be overlooked. The policies shifted rapidly, with new protocols requiring every employee's suggestions to be formally reviewed regardless of position, and a culture of inclusivity began to replace the culture of fear. Recruitment surged, with candidates from around the world citing Angela's story as their inspiration to apply. The viral video continued to circulate, reaching millions, becoming not just a moment of corporate drama, but a symbol of justice. 6 months later, Angela stood in Munich at the unveiling of Tech Vanguard's European production line. The air filled with the scent of oil and steel, the stage crowded with investors, engineers, and journalists. Behind her, delivery trucks, powered by the very engine she had saved, rolled into demonstration, their movements smooth, their systems flawless, their engines singing in harmony. Angela's name was now etched into patents. Her picture featured in industry journals, her voice sought in conferences, but she carried her fame with the humility of someone who knew where she had started. She still lived in her modest apartment, still kept her community college diploma framed on the wall, now flanked by awards and certificates, and still visited her mother weekly with flowers and groceries. She never forgot the scars of discrimination, but she chose to carry them not as chains, but as reminders of the cost of silence and the power of persistence. One afternoon, months after her triumph, she encountered Richard Sterling in the company cafeteria. His tailored suits had been replaced by plainer attire, his once predatory confidence reduced to weary humility. He approached her slowly, his voice quieter than she had ever heard. "Angela," he said, his tone stripped of arrogance, "I owe you an apology. I was blind, and I let my pride and prejudice destroy what should have been obvious. I hope you can forgive me and maybe even guide me toward being a better leader, even in the smaller role I have left." Angela studied him for a long moment, seeing not the tyrant of the boardroom, but a man broken by his own flaws. And she thought of her grandfather's words about engines and people alike. Respect their language and they will respond with truth. She nodded slowly. "Everyone deserves a chance to grow," she said. "The question is whether you're ready to listen with the same attention you would give to a machine that needs repair." Richard lowered his head, accepting the quiet rebuke with the humility he once lacked. The story of Angela Washington did not end with revenge or bitterness, but with transformation. Her rise became a testament that talent could not be buried forever, that the voices dismissed as background noise could one day reshape the future, and that justice in corporate America, though rare, was possible when the underestimated finally had their chance to be heard. She carried the message wherever she went, that true innovation was not about titles or pedigrees, but about the willingness to listen, to respect, to recognize brilliance in unexpected places. And as she stood in the glow of her achievements, watching engines she had saved power fleets across continents, she whispered to herself the lesson that had guided her all along. Engines don't lie, and neither does the truth. The end. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. Stories like Angela Washington's remind us how prejudice can blind people to real talent, and how courage can turn humiliation into triumph. If you felt the shift of power in this plot and the way justice found its voice, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of Angela's journey struck you the most? And where are you watching this from? Your perspective could add another layer to the conversation. Make sure to subscribe if you want more stories where hidden strength overcomes doubt, and don't forget to like this video so more people can discover it.